Picture this. A young woman in military dress uniform stands before hundreds of her peers, holding a medal that should represent honor and achievement. Instead, whispers fill the room, snickers echo from the back rows, and some soldiers openly roll their eyes. They think she doesn't deserve it. They believe she's just another diversity hire, another political statement wrapped in ribbons and brass. What they don't know is that this woman has already saved more lives than most of them ever will. What they can't see is the countless sleepless nights, the impossible decisions, and the moment she chose to risk everything when everyone else had given up hope. This is the story of Captain Maria Santos, a military medic whose award ceremony became a mockery, until the day an entire army discovered what real courage looks like. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with unwavering determination to do what's right when the whole world is watching you fail. The medal in her hands wasn't just a piece of metal. It was proof that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and sometimes the people we underestimate are the ones who end up saving us all. Maria Santos never planned to join the military. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she watched her older brother Carlos come home from his first deployment changed, quieter, carrying invisible wounds that no Purple Heart could heal. Her parents, both hardworking immigrants who had built a life from nothing, hoped their daughter would become a doctor or a lawyer, something safe and respectable. But Maria had always been drawn to helping people in crisis. As a teenager, she volunteered at the local hospital, spending weekends cleaning bedpans and comforting patients who had no visitors. She learned to speak softly to frightened children and hold the hands of elderly patients who just needed someone to listen. The nurses noticed her natural ability to calm people during their worst moments, and by her senior year of high school, they were encouraging her to pursue nursing. Everything changed the night of the accident. Maria was 17 when she witnessed a multi-car collision on a highway outside town. She was driving home from her hospital volunteer shift when she saw the twisted metal and broken glass scattered across 3 lanes. Without thinking, she pulled over and ran toward the wreckage, her basic first aid training kicking in automatically. The first car contained a young family. The father was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound, while the mother frantically tried to free their crying toddler from a car seat. Maria helped extract the child, checking for injuries with steady hands despite her racing heart. She created a makeshift pressure bandage from her jacket to stop the father's bleeding, all while directing the mother to apply pressure to her own cut arm. But it was the second car that would haunt her dreams and ultimately change her path. Inside was an elderly man, trapped by twisted metal, conscious but fading fast. The paramedics were still 10 minutes away, and Maria could see that he didn't have 10 minutes. She crawled through the passenger window, cutting her arms on broken glass, and found herself face to face with a man who reminded her of her grandfather. "I can't feel my legs," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Maria took his hand and looked directly into his eyes. "What's your name, sir?" "Frank. Frank Martinez." "Frank, I'm Maria. I'm going to stay right here with you until help arrives, okay? You're not alone." For 8 minutes, she held Frank's hand and kept him talking. She asked about his family, his job, his favorite memories. She made up stories about her own life to keep him focused. When he started to lose consciousness, she gently slapped his cheek and made him recite his grandchildren's names. She monitored his pulse, watched his breathing, and when the paramedics finally arrived, Frank was still alive. 3 weeks later, Maria received a phone call that would change everything. Frank Martinez had not only survived, but had made a full recovery. He wanted to thank the young woman who had stayed with him in his darkest moment. When they met at the hospital, Frank, a retired Army sergeant, looked at this 17-year-old girl and saw something special. "You have a gift," he told her. "Not everyone can stay calm when everything is falling apart. Not everyone can make a scared old man feel safe when he's certain he's about to die. The military needs people like you." Maria laughed. "I'm not military material. I'm going to study nursing." Frank smiled. "The Army has nurses too. But more than that, they have medics. People who run toward danger when everyone else runs away. People who save lives under impossible circumstances." He paused, studying her face. "People exactly like you." That conversation planted a seed that grew slowly over the following months. Maria began researching military medical training, learning about the advanced emergency medicine techniques that Army medics learned. She discovered that military medics often gained more hands-on experience in a single deployment than civilian emergency room nurses gained in years of practice. But it was her conversation with her brother Carlos that finally convinced her. She found him one evening sitting alone on their back porch, staring at nothing. "Carlos, what was it really like over there?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "The worst part wasn't the fighting. It was watching good people get hurt and not being able to help them. Our medic, Rodriguez, he was a hero. Every day, he saved lives. Every day, he gave families back their sons, their fathers, their brothers." Carlos looked at his sister. "If you really want to make a difference in this world, there's no better way than being the person who brings people home alive." That night, Maria made her decision. She would enlist as soon as she graduated high school and train to become an Army medic. When she told her parents, her mother cried for 3 hours. Her father didn't speak to her for a week. They had escaped poverty and violence in their home country, only to watch their daughter voluntarily walk into danger. But Maria had found her calling. She spent her remaining months of high school preparing physically and mentally for military life. She ran every morning, studied anatomy and physiology in her spare time, and continued volunteering at the hospital with new purpose. The nurses who had become her mentors were divided in their opinions. Some thought she was throwing away a promising future in civilian medicine. Others understood that she had found something bigger than herself to serve. Graduation day arrived with mixed emotions. While her classmates celebrated their acceptance letters to universities, Maria held her military enlistment papers. At the graduation party, her friends joked that she was crazy to give up her freedom for military discipline. Some made comments about her not being tough enough for military life, about how she would probably wash out of basic training within weeks. Maria smiled and kept her thoughts to herself. She had learned something important the night of the car accident. Courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. She was terrified of what lay ahead, but she was more afraid of spending her life wondering what might have been. The night before she left for basic training, Frank Martinez came to her going-away party. He brought with him a small gift, a military medical handbook that had belonged to his son, who had served as a medic in Afghanistan. Inside the front cover, he had written a message that Maria would carry with her through everything that followed. To Maria, who reminded an old soldier that angels don't always have wings. Some have steady hands and brave hearts. Make us proud. As Maria packed her bags that final night, she included the handbook and thought about the journey ahead. She knew that many people doubted her decision, that some questioned whether a small-town girl could handle the demands of military medicine. She understood that she would have to prove herself every day, that respect would have to be earned through actions, not words. What she couldn't have imagined was how prophetic Frank's words would prove to be. She had no way of knowing that within 3 years, she would face situations that would test every ounce of her courage and skill. She couldn't foresee the moment when hundreds of soldiers would question her worthiness, or the day when that same group would stand and salute her sacrifice. But as she turned off the light in her childhood bedroom for the last time, Maria Santos was ready to begin the journey that would transform her from a small-town volunteer into one of the most decorated medics in Army history. She was ready to discover what she was truly capable of when everything was on the line. The girl who had once held a stranger's hand in a broken car was about to learn that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from the battles we choose to fight, but from the people we choose to save along the way. And sometimes the very qualities that make others doubt us are exactly what make us heroes. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston was everything Maria had expected and nothing she was prepared for. From the moment she stepped off the bus at 0400 hours, drill sergeants were screaming instructions that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Her fellow recruits came from all walks of life. Farm boys from Iowa, city kid from Detroit, college graduates who couldn't find jobs, and high school dropouts looking for a second chance. Maria quickly learned that being a woman in a male-dominated environment meant fighting twice as hard for half the recognition. During physical training, she had to complete the same runs, the same obstacle courses, and the same endurance tests as men who outweighed her by 50 pounds. When she struggled with the rope climb in week 3, she heard snickers from some of her male counterparts. Maybe she should have stayed home and become a nurse like a normal girl. One recruit whispered loudly enough for her to hear. That night, Maria practiced on the rope until her hands bled. The next morning, She completed the climb in record time. She learned not to respond to the comments, but to let her performance speak for itself. By the end of basic training, the same recruits who had doubted her were asking for her help with medical terminology and anatomy. Advanced individual training for Army medics pushed Maria to her absolute limits. The program was designed to compress years of medical education into 16 weeks of intensive study and hands-on practice. Students learned everything from basic wound care to advanced trauma surgery, from combat casualty care to field sanitation. The failure rate was nearly 40%. Maria excelled in the classroom portions, but the practical exercises revealed gaps in her confidence. During a simulated combat scenario, she froze when faced with multiple casualties and limited resources. The instructor, Sergeant First Class Davidson, a gruff veteran with 20 years of experience, pulled her aside afterward. "Santos, you got the knowledge, but knowledge isn't enough when bullets are flying and people are dying. You need to trust your instincts and make decisions fast. Second-guessing yourself gets people killed." That feedback stung because Maria knew it was true. She had always been cautious, methodical, someone who thought through every possibility before acting. But combat medicine didn't allow for careful deliberation. She had to learn to trust her training and act decisively under pressure. The turning point came during a particularly challenging field exercise. The scenario involved a simulated IED explosion with multiple casualties, limited medical supplies, and hostile fire. Maria found herself as the senior medic for her team, responsible for triaging 6 wounded soldiers with varying degrees of injury. As the exercise began, everything went wrong. The radio didn't work. Half the medical supplies were destroyed in the simulated blast, and the instructors kept adding complications to increase the stress level. 2 of Maria's teammates panicked and froze. Another began treating minor wounds while ignoring more serious injuries. Maria felt the familiar surge of uncertainty, the voice in her head questioning every decision. But then she remembered Frank Martinez, lying in that twisted car, trusting her to know what to do. She remembered her brother's words about medics being heroes who brought people home alive. She took a deep breath and began issuing clear, firm orders. "Johnson, start in 4 on the unconscious patient and monitor his airway. Williams, pressure dressing on that leg wound, then help me stabilize this chest injury. Martinez, you're with me on the sucking chest wound." For the next 20 minutes, Maria orchestrated a complex medical response with limited resources. She made rapid triage decisions, prioritizing treatment based on who could be saved and who had the best chance of survival. She improvised solutions when standard procedures weren't possible, using torn uniform pieces as bandages and fashioning splints from broken equipment. When the exercise ended, Sergeant Davidson gathered the entire class. "That," he said, pointing at Maria, "is how it's done. Santos just saved 5 lives with half the supplies and twice the complications most of you had. She made hard decisions quickly and stuck with them. That's what separates real medics from people who just completed the training." But Maria's success in training didn't immediately translate to acceptance in her first unit assignment. She was posted to the 3rd Infantry Division at Fort Stewart, Georgia, as part of a combat support company preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. As the newest medic and one of only 3 women in the company, she found herself under constant scrutiny. Her squad leader, Staff Sergeant Brooks, was a career soldier who had done 3 previous deployments. He wasn't openly hostile to Maria, but he made it clear that he had reservations about having a female medic in his squad. "Nothing personal, Santos," he told her during their first private conversation. "But when we're downrange and someone's life is on the line, I need to know that my medic can handle the physical demands. Can you carry a wounded soldier to safety under fire? Can you keep up during a 15-mile patrol with full gear?" Maria understood his concerns, even if they frustrated her. Military medicine wasn't just about medical skills. It required physical strength, endurance, and the ability to function effectively in combat conditions. She knew that proving herself would require more than just good grades and textbook knowledge. She threw herself into physical training with the same intensity she had applied to her medical studies. She spent extra hours in the gym, worked with the unit's physical training instructor to improve her strength and endurance, and practiced tactical medicine scenarios until they became second nature. Her opportunity to prove herself came during a field training exercise at the Joint Readiness Training Center in Louisiana. The exercise was designed to simulate the conditions they would face in Afghanistan, complete with mock villages, role-playing civilians, and unexpected medical emergencies. On the third day of the exercise, during a simulated patrol, Maria's squad encountered a complex scenario. An improvised explosive device had detonated near a convoy, creating multiple casualties with varying degrees of injury. The exercise controllers had added complications: limited visibility due to simulated smoke, hostile fire from role players, and communication difficulties. The senior medic, who was supposed to lead the medical response, became disoriented in the chaos and began to panic. Maria found herself as the effective medical leader for the entire scene, responsible for coordinating the treatment of 8 casualties while under simulated enemy fire. She immediately established a casualty collection point in a protected area and began rapid triage. She identified 2 patients with life-threatening injuries who needed immediate attention, 3 with serious but stable injuries, and 3 with minor wounds who could wait for treatment. Working under incredible pressure, Maria performed life-saving procedures while directing other medics and non-medical soldiers in supporting roles. She established airways, controlled bleeding, treated shock, and coordinated medical evacuations, all while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation around her. What impressed the evaluators most was not just her medical skills, but her leadership under pressure. She made clear, decisive commands that other soldiers followed without question. She maintained her composure when complications arose and adapted quickly when initial treatment plans didn't work as expected. Staff Sergeant Brooks, who had been one of her patients during the exercise, was amazed by her performance. "Santos," he told her afterward, "I've never seen a medic that knew take charge like that. You didn't just treat patients, you led the entire medical response. You got something special." Word of Maria's performance spread quickly through the company and beyond. Other squad leaders began requesting her for their teams. Officers who had initially been skeptical of having a female medic in their unit started viewing her as an asset rather than a liability. But success brought its own challenges. Some soldiers resented her rapid rise in reputation, suggesting that she was receiving favorable treatment because of her gender. Others questioned whether her performance in training exercises would translate to real combat conditions. Maria tried not to let the criticism affect her, but it was difficult to ignore the whispered comments and sideways glances. She found herself constantly working to prove that she belonged, that her success was based on merit rather than politics or special treatment. The situation came to a head during a company-wide training event. Maria was tasked with teaching a class on combat casualty care to soldiers from other units. As she began her presentation, she could see skepticism in many faces. Some soldiers exchanged eye rolls, others whispered comments about Girl Scouts playing soldier. Halfway through her presentation, a sergeant from another company interrupted her. "No offense, but how do we know you can actually do this stuff in a real fight? It's easy to talk about in a classroom, but combat is different." The room fell silent. Maria felt every eye on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She could have gotten angry, could have cited her training scores or exercise performances. Instead, she did something unexpected. "You're absolutely right," she said calmly. "You don't know if I can do this in real combat. Neither do I, to be completely honest. What I can tell you is that I've trained as hard as I can, I've studied every manual, and I've practiced these procedures until I can do them in my sleep. But you're right that none of that guarantees performance under fire." She paused, looking around the room. "Here's what I do know. Every day, I think about the fact that someone's life might depend on my skills and my decisions. That responsibility keeps me up at night, and it drives me to be better every single day. Whether I'm male or female, tall or short, experienced or new, that responsibility is the same. And I'm going to do everything in my power to be worthy of that trust." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, the same sergeant who had challenged her raised his hand. "Roger that," he said simply. "Continue with the training." After that incident, Maria noticed a shift in how she was perceived. She wasn't just the female medic anymore. She was Santos, the medic who was serious about her job and honest about her limitations. Soldiers began approaching her with genuine medical questions, seeking her advice and expertise. As deployment to Afghanistan approached, Maria felt a mixture of excitement and terror. All her training, all her preparation, was leading to this moment. She would finally discover whether she had what it took to be an effective combat medic, whether she could live up to the trust that her fellow soldiers were placing in her. She spent her final weeks in garrison studying intelligence reports about their destination, familiarizing herself with the types of injuries and medical challenges she might face. She practiced her medical procedures obsessively, knowing that muscle memory could be the difference between life and death when adrenaline was flowing and chaos was everywhere. The night before deployment, Staff Sergeant Brooks pulled her aside for a final conversation. "Santos, I want you to know that I was wrong about you initially. You've proven that you belong here, that you have what it takes to be an outstanding medic. Your soldiers trust you, and so do I." As Maria packed her medical bags for deployment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From a teenage volunteer in a small Texas hospital to a combat medic preparing for war, she had overcome doubt, prejudice, and her own fears to earn her place. But she knew that the real test was still ahead. Soon, she would discover what she was truly capable of when lives were on the line and failure was not an option. The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan on a scorching August morning. As Maria stepped off the aircraft, the heat hit her like a physical force, dry and overwhelming even at dawn. The landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and tan, punctuated by jagged mountains that seemed to rise from the earth like ancient monuments. This was her new home for the next 15 months. FOB Chapman was a sprawling complex of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and dust. Lots of dust. Within hours, Maria discovered that dust became part of everything. Her food, her equipment, her medical supplies. The base housed nearly 3,000 soldiers from various units, all working to maintain security and stability in a region that had known little of either for decades. Maria was assigned to Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, whose primary mission was to conduct patrols throughout the surrounding villages and mountains, building relationships with local leaders while searching for insurgent activity. Her medical station was a converted shipping container equipped with basic trauma care equipment, medications, and a direct radio link to the larger medical facility at Bagram Airfield. Her first patient arrived before she had finished unpacking her equipment. A young soldier from Bravo Company had been working on fortifications when a piece of equipment malfunctioned, sending a metal fragment into his forearm. The wound was painful but not life-threatening, requiring cleaning, suturing, and follow-up care. As Maria worked to clean and dress the wound, she noticed that word of her arrival had spread quickly. Several soldiers lingered outside her medical station, curious about the new medic. She could hear fragments of conversation, questions about her experience, speculation about how she would handle combat situations, and the inevitable comments about having a female medic in a forward combat role. "She looks young," one soldier observed. "They all look young until they've been here a few months," another replied. "Question is whether she can handle it when things get real." Maria focused on her patient and tried to ignore the commentary. She had expected skepticism and knew that her reputation would be built through actions, not words. She completed the procedure efficiently and professionally, providing clear instructions for wound care and follow-up treatment. Her first month at Chapman was relatively quiet, filled with routine medical calls, treating stomach ailments from questionable local food, caring for soldiers who had developed respiratory problems from the constant dust, and handling the minor injuries that occurred during daily operations. She also spent time treating Afghan civilians who came to the base seeking medical assistance, from children with infected wounds to elderly men with chronic conditions that had gone untreated for years. It was during one of these civilian treatment sessions that Maria first encountered the complexity of providing medical care in a war zone. An Afghan woman brought her young daughter to the base, explaining through an interpreter that the child had been experiencing severe stomach pain for days. The girl, perhaps 8 years old, was clearly malnourished and dehydrated. As Maria examined the child, she realized that the symptoms suggested appendicitis, a condition that required immediate surgical intervention. But the nearest surgical facility was at Bagram, more than an hour away by helicopter, and medical evacuations for civilians required special authorization that could take hours to obtain. Maria found herself facing an impossible choice. If she was right about the diagnosis, the child would die without surgery. If she was wrong and used military resources for an unnecessary evacuation, she would face serious consequences. and if she waited for authorization, the child might deteriorate beyond the point where surgery could save her. She made a decision that would define her approach to military medicine for the rest of her deployment. She contacted the battalion medical officer and explained the situation, recommending immediate evacuation despite the bureaucratic complications. When asked if she was certain about her diagnosis, Maria replied with confidence she wasn't sure she felt. "Sir, I can't be 100% certain without advanced diagnostic equipment. But based on her symptoms and physical examination, I believe this child will die without immediate surgical intervention. I recommend we evacuate now and sort out the paperwork later." The evacuation was approved. 3 hours later, Maria received word that her diagnosis had been correct. The child had undergone successful surgery to remove a ruptured appendix. Without immediate treatment, she would not have survived. Word of Maria's decision spread throughout the battalion. Some praised her for her diagnostic skills and her willingness to take risks to save a life. Others questioned whether military medical resources should be used for civilian cases, especially when the diagnosis was uncertain. But Staff Sergeant Brooks, who had been present during the incident, defended her choice. Santos made a tough call under pressure. He told anyone who would listen. She put her reputation on the line to save a kid's life. "That's the kind of medic I want watching my back." Maria's first real test under combat conditions came 6 weeks into her deployment. Alpha Company was conducting a routine patrol through a village called Canabad when they encountered an improvised explosive device hidden beneath the road surface. The explosion was devastating, occurring just as the lead vehicle passed over the device. Maria was in the third vehicle when the IED detonated. The blast was unlike anything she had experienced in training, a violent shock wave that seemed to compress the air and shake the ground. Immediately, radio chatter filled with urgent calls for medical assistance. "IED strike. IED strike. We have multiple casualties. Medic to the front." Maria grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the damaged vehicle, her training overriding the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The scene was chaotic. Smoke and dust clouded the air. Soldiers were shouting orders and calling for ammunition, and the acrid smell of explosives mixed with the metallic scent of blood. The lead vehicle had taken the brunt of the explosion. The armored hull had protected the occupants from complete destruction, but the blast had caused severe injuries to 3 soldiers. The gunner, Specialist Johnson, had been thrown from his position and was unconscious with obvious head trauma. The driver, Private Martinez, was trapped in his seat with what appeared to be a broken leg and internal injuries. The vehicle commander, Sergeant Peterson, was conscious but bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds to his chest and arms. Maria established her priorities quickly. Johnson needed immediate airway management and spinal stabilization. Martinez required extraction from a vehicle and treatment for shock. Peterson needed bleeding control, but was stable enough to wait for initial treatment of the more critical patients. Working under intense pressure, Maria began life-saving procedures while other soldiers provided security and called for medical evacuation. She established an airway for Johnson using techniques she had practiced hundreds of times, but never performed on an actual combat casualty. She started in 4-line on Martinez while he was still trapped in the vehicle, monitoring his vital signs and treating him for shock. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, but those 20 minutes felt like hours. Maria had to make continuous assessments and adjustments to her treatment as the patient's conditions changed. Johnson regained consciousness but became confused and combative, requiring careful management to prevent further injury to his spine. Martinez's blood pressure dropped dangerously low, requiring immediate fluid resuscitation. As the helicopter lifted off with the 3 casualties, Maria felt a complex mixture of exhaustion, relief, and uncertainty. She had performed her job under extreme conditions, but she wouldn't know for hours whether her patients would survive. The answer came the next day through the medical evacuation system. All 3 soldiers were alive. Johnson had a severe concussion, but no permanent brain damage. Martinez required surgery to repair internal bleeding, but was expected to make a full recovery. Peterson's wounds were serious, but not life-threatening. Maria's quick thinking and skilled treatment had been instrumental in saving all 3 lives. The successful outcome of her first major combat casualty event established Maria's reputation throughout the battalion. Soldiers who had previously questioned her abilities now spoke of her with respect and confidence. Officers who had harbored doubts about having a female medic in a combat role became some of her strongest supporters. But Maria's success also brought increased responsibilities and greater challenges. As word of her skill spread, she found herself being called upon for increasingly complex medical situations. When a local Afghan army unit suffered casualties during a joint operation, Maria was requested specifically to provide medical support. When a civilian vehicle hit an old landmine, she was the medic chosen to treat the family involved. Each successful mission added to her reputation, but also increased the pressure she felt to maintain her high standards. She knew that soldiers throughout the battalion were watching her, that her failures would be scrutinized more intensely than her successes. She also understood that she was representing not just herself, but all the women who would follow her into similar roles. The stress began to take its toll. Maria found herself double-checking every decision, staying awake at night, replaying medical scenarios, and constantly studying to ensure she was prepared for any situation that might arise. She pushed herself physically and mentally, determined to never be the weak link in her unit's capabilities. Her breaking point came during a particularly challenging month when Alpha Company was conducting operations in a remote area known for heavy insurgent activity. The pace of operations was intense, with daily patrols and frequent contact with enemy forces. Maria had treated dozens of casualties, both military and civilian, and the emotional weight of constantly dealing with trauma and death was becoming overwhelming. The incident that nearly broke her involved a young Afghan boy, perhaps 10 years old, who had been caught in crossfire between insurgents and coalition forces. The child had suffered multiple gunshot wounds and was brought to Maria's aid station in critical condition. Despite her best efforts, using every technique she knew and every piece of equipment available, Maria could not save him. She watched the life fade from his eyes as she continued CPR long after any reasonable hope of recovery had passed. When she finally stopped, her hands were covered in blood, and she was sobbing uncontrollably. Staff Sergeant Brooks found her an hour later, sitting alone outside her medical station, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her without saying a word, understanding that sometimes the best support was simple presence. "I should have been able to save him," Maria finally said. "There has to have been something else I could have done." Brooks was quiet for a moment before responding. "Santos, you've saved more lives in the past 4 months than most medics save in an entire career. You can't save everyone. The moment you think you can is the moment you lose perspective on what you're really here to do." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That kid died because of a war, not because of anything you did or didn't do. You gave him the best chance anyone could have given him. That's all any of us can do." The conversation helped Maria regain her perspective, but it also marked a turning point in her deployment. She realized that being a combat medic required not just medical skills and physical courage, but emotional resilience and the ability to accept that some battles couldn't be won. As her deployment entered its final months, Maria had established herself as one of the most respected medics in the battalion. She had successfully treated hundreds of patients, saved dozens of lives, and earned the complete trust and confidence of the soldiers she served with. Her medical station had become a place where soldiers sought not just treatment for injuries, but advice and support during difficult times. But her greatest challenge was still ahead. The incident that would define her career and change how an entire army viewed her was approaching, though she had no way of knowing it. Soon, she would face a situation that would test every aspect of her training, her courage, and her character. And when it was over, the same soldiers who had once questioned her worthiness would stand to honor her sacrifice. The mission began like hundreds of others Maria had participated in during her deployment. Alpha Company was tasked with conducting a joint patrol with Afghan National Army units through a series of villages in the Khas province, an area known for insurgent activity, but also for its strategic importance to regional stability. Intelligence reports suggested possible weapons caches in the area, but the threat level was assessed as moderate. Maria prepared her medical kit with the same methodical care she had developed over months of combat operations. Trauma supplies for fluids, pain medications, airway management tools, and the portable defibrillator that had saved 3 lives in previous missions. She checked and double-checked every piece of equipment, knowing that in combat situations, there would be no opportunity to retrieve forgotten items. The patrol consisted of 32 American soldiers and 18 Afghan army personnel, moving in a convoy of 8 vehicles through terrain that shifted from rocky mountain paths to agricultural valleys. Maria was positioned in the middle vehicle, providing her with the best opportunity to reach casualties anywhere in the convoy quickly. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the battalion commander, was personally leading this mission due to its political importance. Recent intelligence suggested that a significant insurgent leader was operating in the area, and successful completion of the mission could substantially disrupt enemy operations throughout the region. 3 hours into the patrol, everything went catastrophically wrong. The attack began with a coordinated ambush that demonstrated sophisticated planning and superior knowledge of the terrain. Insurgents had positioned themselves in elevated positions on both sides of a narrow valley, creating a devastating crossfire that trapped the convoy with limited escape routes. The initial barrage of rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons fire disabled 2 vehicles immediately and caused multiple casualties. But this was only the beginning of what would become a 15-hour battle that would test every aspect of Maria's training and character. The radio chatter was chaotic and urgent. Contact left. Contact right. RPG. RPG. Casualties in Vehicle 2. Casualties in Vehicle 7. We need immediate medical assistance. Maria's vehicle took heavy fire as she attempted to reach the first casualty site. Bullets shattered the windshield and punctured the armored sides, but the driver managed to maneuver close enough for her to dismount under covering fire from her fellow soldiers. The scene that greeted her was unlike anything she had encountered in previous combat situations. Vehicle 2 had taken a direct hit from an RPG, killing the gunner instantly and seriously wounding 3 other soldiers. The blast had also set fire to the ammunition stored in the vehicle, creating an ongoing explosion hazard that prevented normal casualty evacuation procedures. Private Anderson, barely 19 years old, had suffered massive trauma to his leg from the RPG blast. He was conscious but losing blood rapidly, and Maria knew that without immediate intervention, he would bleed to death within minutes. The problem was that treating him required exposing herself to intense enemy fire from the surrounding hills. Without hesitation, Maria crawled through the broken glass and twisted metal to reach Anderson. Bullets struck the ground around her as she worked to apply tourniquets to both legs, stopping the massive hemorrhaging that was threatening his life. She established in 4-line while lying flat against the damaged vehicle, using its bulk as cover from the continuous gunfire. "Stay with me, Anderson," she shouted over the noise of battle. "You're going home alive. I promise you that." While treating Anderson, Maria became aware of additional casualties throughout the convoy. The radio reports painted a devastating picture. Multiple soldiers wounded, vehicles disabled, and the entire unit trapped in a carefully planned ambush with limited options for escape or reinforcement. Staff Sergeant Brooks, her squad leader and strongest supporter, had been wounded in the initial attack. A bullet had shattered his shoulder, and shrapnel from an exploding grenade had caused serious wounds to his chest. He was conscious but weakening from blood loss. Maria faced an impossible decision. Anderson's condition was stabilized, but required constant monitoring. Brooks needed immediate attention to prevent shock and possible death from his wounds. There were reports of additional casualties in other vehicles that she hadn't even reached yet. And throughout all of this, the enemy fire was so intense that any movement between casualty sites risked death or injury. She made the decision that would define her career. Instead of staying in a protected position with Anderson, she chose to move between casualty sites under heavy fire, treating multiple wounded soldiers while exposing herself to deadly enemy attacks. Her first movement was to reach Brooks, who was trapped behind the engine block of his damaged vehicle. The distance was only 50 meters, but crossing it required running through an open area that was being targeted by multiple enemy positions. Maria loaded Anderson onto a makeshift stretcher and, with the help of 2 other soldiers, moved both patients to a more protected position. The movement drew intense enemy fire. Bullets struck the ground inches from Maria's feet as she ran, and One round passed so close to her head that she could hear its distinctive crack. But she reached Brooks successfully and immediately began treating his wounds while keeping Anderson under observation. Brooks was slipping into shock from blood loss. Maria started in 4-line and administered fluids while applying pressure dressings to his wounds. As she worked, he grabbed her arm with his uninjured hand. "Santos, you need to get out of here," he whispered. "This is too dangerous. Let someone else handle the casualties." Maria looked directly into his eyes. "Brooks, you've had my back for months. Now I have yours. Nobody dies today if I can prevent it." As she continued treating Brooks, reports came over the radio of additional casualties. Vehicle 7 had hit an improvised explosive device while attempting to maneuver out of the ambush, causing serious injuries to 4 soldiers. The convoy medic assigned to that vehicle had been killed in the initial attack, leaving those casualties without immediate medical support. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, despite being under heavy fire himself, made a decision that would later be reviewed and debated by military historians. Instead of ordering Maria to remain in a protected position, he authorized her to move between casualty sites as she deemed necessary, essentially giving her tactical control over all medical operations for the entire convoy. "Santos," his voice crackled over the radio, "you're our only functioning medic. I'm giving you complete autonomy to provide medical support wherever you think it's needed most. We'll provide covering fire, but the medical decisions are yours." What followed was 6 hours of the most intense combat medical operations in recent military history. Maria moved between casualty sites under constant enemy fire, treating a total of 14 wounded soldiers while coordinating medical evacuations and managing limited medical supplies. She performed advanced trauma procedures in conditions that defied every principle of medical practice. She conducted emergency surgery to stop internal bleeding while bullets struck the ground around her. She managed multiple airways while coordinating with helicopter pilots who were attempting medical evacuations under fire. During the most critical phase of the battle, Maria faced her greatest test. Sergeant Peterson, the vehicle commander she had treated in her first combat medical emergency months earlier, had suffered a penetrating chest wound that was causing his lung to collapse. The condition, called tension pneumothorax, would kill him within minutes without immediate treatment. The procedure required to save his life, emergency needle decompression, had to be performed with precision and confidence. Any mistake could puncture his heart or major blood vessels, causing immediate death. And the procedure had to be performed while under heavy enemy fire in less than ideal conditions. Maria positioned herself over Peterson, using her own body to shield him from the ongoing gunfire. She located the precise anatomical landmarks by feel, inserted the needle at exactly the correct angle and depth, and successfully relieved the pressure in his chest cavity. The procedure saved his life, but it also drew concentrated enemy fire toward their position. During the treatment, a bullet struck the ground less than 6 inches from Maria's head, spraying dirt and debris across both her and Peterson. Another round struck her medical bag, destroying several critical supplies, but missing her body by mere centimeters. "Doc," Peterson whispered as his breathing improved, "you just saved my life while people are actively trying to kill you. That's either incredibly brave or completely insane." Maria smiled despite the chaos around them. "Probably both," she replied. The battle continued for another 9 hours, with Maria continuously moving between patients, reassessing their conditions, and adapting her treatment as circumstances changed. She managed medical evacuations while under fire, coordinated with incoming medical support, and maintained the morale of wounded soldiers who were terrified of dying in a remote Afghan valley. By the time reinforcements arrived and the enemy positions were neutralized, Maria had personally treated 14 wounded soldiers, coordinated the medical evacuation of 8 critical casualties, and prevented any deaths within her area of operations. Every soldier she treated survived their initial injuries, though several faced long recoveries. When the final casualty evacuation helicopter lifted off, Maria collapsed from exhaustion. She had been functioning on pure adrenaline for 15 hours, treating life-threatening injuries while under constant threat of death. Her uniform was torn and bloody, her medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and her hands were shaking from the combination of fatigue and stress. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached her as she sat against a damaged vehicle. staring at the battlefield where she had just spent the most intense day of her life. He knelt down beside her and spoke quietly. "Santos, what you did today was extraordinary. You saved 14 lives while putting your own at risk repeatedly. You made decisions under impossible circumstances and performed medical procedures that I've never seen attempted in combat conditions." He paused, studying her face. "I'm recommending you for the Silver Star. Your actions today represent the highest standards of military medical service, and every soldier in this battalion owes you a debt they can never repay." Maria was too exhausted to fully process what he was saying. All she could think about was that everyone had survived, that she had kept her promise to bring them home alive. She had discovered something about herself that day. When everything was on the line and failure meant death, she was capable of extraordinary things. But she had no idea that her greatest challenge was still ahead. Soon, she would discover that surviving combat was easier than surviving the politics and prejudices that awaited her back home. The same actions that had saved 14 lives would become the subject of controversy and doubt, leading to the moment when hundreds of soldiers would question whether she deserved the recognition she had earned with her blood, sweat, and courage. The girl from small-town Texas had become a hero in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now she would have to prove that heroism all over again to people who hadn't been there, who hadn't seen what she was capable of when everything mattered most. The ceremony was scheduled for a Thursday morning at Fort Stewart, Georgia, 6 months after Maria's return from Afghanistan. The Silver Star presentation was to be part of a larger awards ceremony recognizing the achievements of multiple soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division's recent deployment. For most attendees, it would be a routine military function, complete with dress uniforms, formal speeches, and the usual military pageantry. But for Maria Santos, walking into that auditorium felt like entering a courtroom where she was both the defendant and the star witness. The controversy had begun almost immediately after the initial reports of her combat actions reached the States. Military bloggers and social media commentators began questioning whether her Silver Star recommendation was based purely on merit or influenced by political pressure to recognize female soldiers in combat roles. Some suggested that the same actions performed by a male soldier would have received less attention and recognition. The whispers followed Maria from her first day back on home station. She overheard fragments of conversations in the dining facility, saw the sideways glances during physical training, and felt the weight of constant scrutiny from soldiers who hadn't been in Afghanistan but had strong opinions about what had happened there. "I heard they're fast-tracking her for promotion too," one sergeant commented within Maria's earshot. "Must be nice to have the diversity police watching your back." 15 hours under fire, my ass," another soldier muttered. "I bet half that story got exaggerated by the time it reached the Pentagon." The comments stung because Maria knew they represented a larger skepticism about her achievements. Despite the detailed after-action reports, witness statements from multiple soldiers, and medical documentation of her life-saving interventions, there remained a persistent doubt about whether she truly deserved the recognition she was receiving. Staff Sergeant Brooks, who had returned to duty with limited mobility due to his shoulder injuries, became one of Maria's most vocal defenders. He confronted soldiers who questioned her actions, distributed copies of the official after-action reports to anyone willing to read them, and repeatedly testified to her heroism during the ambush. "I was there," he would tell skeptics. "I watched Santos crawl through machine gun fire to save Anderson's life. I felt her hands stopping the bleeding that would have killed me. Anyone who questions what she did that day is questioning my word, and I take that personally." But even Brooks' support couldn't completely shield Maria from the growing controversy surrounding her award. As the ceremony approached, she became increasingly aware that she was representing more than just herself. Female soldiers throughout the military were watching to see how she would be received, while critics were waiting for any sign that her recognition was undeserved. 3 days before the ceremony, Maria learned that several soldiers from other units had requested permission to attend the event. Some were coming to show support, but others, she suspected, were coming to bear witness to what they viewed as a politically motivated spectacle. The night before the ceremony, Maria called her parents in Texas. Her mother, who had initially opposed her military service, had become one of her proudest supporters, following every news story about her daughter's deployment and keeping a scrapbook of articles about her achievements. "Mija," her mother said softly, "I know this is difficult for you. I know people are saying things that hurt. But I want you to remember something. You didn't save those soldiers for glory or recognition. You saved them because it was right, because that's who you are. No ceremony and no medal can add to or take away from that truth. Her father, a man of few words, came on the line briefly. Maria, your grandfather fought in Vietnam. He came home to people who called him names, who questioned his service. He told me something I want to tell you. The opinions of people who weren't there don't change what happened there. Stand tall tomorrow. The morning of the ceremony arrived with typical Georgia humidity and the kind of military precision that turned routine events into formal productions. Maria dressed carefully in her Army service uniform, ensuring that every detail met regulation standards. She knew that her appearance, her bearing, and her conduct will be scrutinized by everyone present. The auditorium at Fort Stewart's main post theater seated nearly 800 people, and it was filled to capacity. Maria was surprised to see familiar faces scattered throughout the audience, soldiers from her deployment, medics from other units, and officers she recognized for various assignments. But she was also aware of the many faces she didn't recognize, people who had come to witness what some viewed as a historic moment and others saw as political theater. As Maria took her designated seat in the front row, she noticed Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had returned from Afghanistan 3 months earlier. He caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of reassurance and support that helped calm her nerves. The ceremony began with the presentation of lesser awards, commendation medals, achievement medals, and certificates of appreciation for various soldiers who had distinguished themselves during the deployment. The audience responded appropriately, with polite applause and the respectful attention that military ceremonies demanded. But Maria could sense a change in the atmosphere as the Silver Star presentation approached. Conversations became more subdued, and she felt the weight of collective attention focusing on her. She had attended dozens of awards ceremonies during her military career, but she had never been the center of one that carried such emotional and political significance. General Patricia Williams, the commanding general of the installation, took the podium to present Maria's award. A decorated veteran of multiple combat deployments, General Williams was known for her direct leadership style and her commitment to recognizing genuine achievement regardless of politics or public relations considerations. Ladies and gentlemen, General Williams began, today we recognize extraordinary valor and life-saving actions performed under the most challenging combat conditions. The Silver Star is our nation's third highest military decoration, reserved for soldiers who demonstrate gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. She paused, allowing the significance of those words to register with the audience. The actions we are recognizing today were witnessed by multiple soldiers, documented through official after-action reports, and verified through medical records that confirm the life-saving treatment provided under enemy fire. Maria stood as her name was called, walking to the center of the stage with the military bearing she had developed over years of service. As General Williams read the citation detailing her actions during the 15-hour battle, Maria could hear the absolute silence in the auditorium. 800 people listening to a recounting of the most intense day of her life. For gallantry in action while engaged in military operations involving conflict with an armed enemy, the citation read, Specialist Santos distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous actions while serving as a combat medic during a complex ambush in Afghanistan. Despite intense enemy fire and at great personal risk, Specialist Santos moved repeatedly between casualty sites, treating 14 wounded soldiers and preventing any combat deaths within her area of operations. The citation continued with specific details of her actions. The emergency procedures performed under fire, the medical evacuations coordinated during active combat, and the leadership she displayed while managing multiple critical casualties simultaneously. As General Williams pinned the Silver Star to Maria's uniform, the auditorium remained silent. Maria could see faces in the audience, some showing clear admiration and respect, others maintaining the neutral expressions that military protocol demanded. She wondered what the soldiers from her unit were thinking, whether they were proud of her recognition or embarrassed by the attention it had generated. General Williams stepped back and prepared to invite the traditional applause that concluded awards presentations. But before she could speak, something unprecedented happened that would forever change how Maria's service was remembered. Staff Sergeant Brooks, despite his ongoing shoulder injuries, stood slowly from his seat in the middle of the auditorium. Without saying a word, he began to clap, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed in the silence. One by one, other soldiers from Alpha Company stood and joined the applause. Then, Sergeant Peterson, whose life Maria had saved with emergency chest surgery under fire, rose from his seat. Private Anderson, whose leg she had saved with tourniquets applied while bullets struck the ground around her, stood and began clapping with tears in his eyes. The standing ovation spread through the auditorium like a wave. Soldiers who had questioned her award, officers who had harbored doubts about her recognition, and personnel who had never heard her story until that morning all rose to their feet in acknowledgement of what they had just heard. But it was what happened next that surprised everyone, including Maria herself. As the applause continued, soldiers throughout the auditorium began to salute. It started with the enlisted personnel from her unit, but quickly spread to include officers, senior non-commissioned officers, and soldiers from completely different commands. This wasn't the traditional applause that concluded most award ceremonies. This was something else entirely. 800 soldiers acknowledging that they had witnessed something extraordinary, that they had been wrong to doubt someone whose courage had been proven in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The salute continued for nearly 3 minutes, an eternity in military protocol. General Williams, a veteran of 30 years who had participated in hundreds of ceremonies, later said she had never witnessed such a spontaneous and powerful demonstration of military respect. When the ceremony finally concluded, Maria was overwhelmed by the response. Soldiers she had never met approached to thank her for her service and to express their admiration for her actions. Officers who had initially questioned her award now spoke of her as an example of the highest standards of military medicine. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found Maria after the ceremony, as she was being congratulated by a group of medics from other units. "Santos," he said, pulling her aside, "I want you to know that what just happened and there was not about your gender, your ethnicity, or military politics. That was about respect for genuine heroism." Those soldiers stood and saluted because they recognize courage when they see it. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Specialist Anderson, the young soldier whose leg she had saved, approached her with his parents, who had flown in from Michigan to attend the ceremony. His father, a veteran of the Gulf War, shook Maria's hand with tears in his eyes. "My son is walking today because of what you did," he said simply. "Our family will never forget that. Thank you for bringing him home." As Maria left the auditorium that day, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to that moment. From the skeptical teenager who had volunteered at a small-town hospital to the decorated combat veteran whose courage had earned the respect of an entire army, she had discovered something important about herself and about the nature of heroism. The medal pinned to her uniform was significant, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that she had kept her promise to bring people home alive, that she had proven that courage comes in many forms, and that heroism is measured not by the recognition it receives, but by the lives it saves. The girl who had once held a stranger's hand in a broken car had grown into a woman who could save lives under the most impossible circumstances. And in doing so, she had shown an entire army that heroes don't always look like what we expect, but they always show up when we need them most. 6 months later, Maria Santos was promoted to sergeant and assigned as a senior medic instructor at the Army Medical Center. Her story became part of the curriculum for combat medic training, teaching future generations of military medical personnel about the courage, skill, and determination required to save lives in combat. She never sought recognition for what she had done in Afghanistan, but she had earned something far more valuable: the absolute trust and respect to the soldiers she had served with, and the knowledge that when everything was on the line, she had been worthy of the faith they had placed in her. The medal was nice, but the lives were what mattered. And in the end, that's what made her a hero.